for that to kick in. Okay, great. Yep, so I'm Emily. I'm the publisher for history at Palgrave Macmillan. And Lucy, before I go ahead and share my screen for the slides, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Lucy Kidwell, and I'm a senior editor for history at Palgrave Macmillan.
Great. So I will just open up the presentation. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the first slide.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So yeah, today we're going to talk about academic book publishing 101. And I know it's obvious, but it's worth saying that the focus today will be on book publishing. But you know, there are other options open to you as well, for example, publishing in journals. And also just to, I guess, be clear that this will be about academic publishing rather than trade publishing, which is really very different. And so if you have questions about trade publishing, probably me and Lucy aren't going to be the best people to kind of ask about that, but we do know a lot about academic publishing, so hopefully this will still be useful. So to start with, we just wanted to give a bit of background on the book formats that Palgrave publishes and also which topics we publish in the humanities as well. So obviously most people today here are probably historians, but we also publish in literature, film, culture and media, theatre and performance, philosophy and religion. So sometimes we get asked at sessions like this, my work is interdisciplinary, you know, does this advice kind of, is it applicable across all disciplines? And it is. So the advice we'll give today is really quite general. And so whether you consider yourself primarily a historian or a historian that crosses over literature and so on, hopefully it'll be useful to you. And then in terms of the book formats, so most of what we publish are academic monographs or edited collections. We also publish some Palgrave pivots, and these are essentially short books. So they're between 25,000 words to 50,000 words in length, and they're essentially designed to give authors sort of a middle option between a very short journal article and a potentially longer monograph. So if you find that you have research that you want to publish at its natural length, you don't want to cut it down for a journal, you don't want to work it up into a monograph, Palgrave Pivot could be an option. In addition to that, we also publish some handbooks, textbooks, and major reference works. But I think the two formats that will probably be most applicable today are monographs and potentially Palgrave pivots. And some of you might find as well that you either you co-edit or you get invited to contribute to an edited collection as well. So obviously me and Lucy are here today, but we actually have two other history editors at Palgrave as well. And I think regardless of which press you decide to go with, you'll find this is probably quite common for a lot of the bigger academic publishers. They'll have multiple editors working across the same discipline. So in terms of who you approach, often you can find information on a publisher's website about their editors and which areas of history they cover. And we're just briefly going to run through the areas that I cover and then Lucy covers and the two other editors so that that's clear for you. So we have four editors. Myself and Lucy are in London. We have one editor in New York and then also one in the Netherlands as well. And between us, as you'll see over the next few slides, we cover pretty much all areas of history and we divide it up between ourselves thematically. So again, different presses take different approaches to this. You might find that some publishers will divide up their history list between their editors chronologically instead. So for example, they might have a modern history editor or a medieval history editor, but we kind of divide it up thematically. In terms of the areas of history that I look after, that I commission in, this is a list of the main series that I look after. And I guess they can kind of be divided up into two parts. The first section on kind of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, racism, genocide, war and crime. That is a big part of what I look after. My previous boss, when she used to introduce me to people, used to say, this is Emily and she does that depressing history, which is true, but it's very kind of worthwhile and meaningful history as well. And then in addition to that, I also look after a lot of our subdisciplines in social history. So oral history, genders and sexualities in history, along with women's history, the history of childhood and the life cycle, the history of emotions and experience, and also the history of media. And then I'm going to pass over to Lucy to talk briefly about what she looks after as well.
Yeah, so like Emily, my list is kind of split into a few different areas. And so one of the biggest parts of my list is the history of science, technology, and medicine. So I've got a few different series in that area. I've just seen someone can't see the presentation. Can everybody else see the presentation, or is it?
I can see it fine.
Yeah,
Lucy,
okay.
can people raise their hand if they can't see the presentation? Okay.
Shall we continue?
Yeah, just continue.
Okay.
If the person who can't see it, if you just leave and come back and I'll let you back into the meeting. Sorry, guys, continue.
Okay, thanks. No worries. A sort of second area of my list, I look after British and Irish history, imperial history, political history, and also international history. And then similarly to Emily, I also have a few series on social history, so the history of social movements, labour and history and society, and new directions in welfare history. And so Emily mentioned that we have two more editors. So Christy Liu is based in the Netherlands, and her list largely focuses on area studies, with a series on African history, the global south, European history, and transnational history. And she also looks after our publications on migration history with two different series in this area. And our fourth editor is Carly Silver, and she's based in New York. And her list mostly focuses on earlier periods of history, with series exploring classic, ancient, and medieval history. Carly also looks after maritime and ocean history, environmental history, and Indigenous history. Before we move on to the rest of the presentation, we just wanted to flag our early career researcher hub on palgrave.com. So the slides will be shared with you afterwards so that you have this link. But here you can find helpful resources and tips for ECRs, including advice on how to adapt the PhD dissertation into a monograph, which we'll also cover in a bit more detail shortly.
Okay, great. And now I guess we'll move on to, the heart of the presentation, where we talk through briefly the main steps towards publication. And we'll touch on each of them in the following slides. So to start with, I know it might sound obvious, but it's to develop an idea. So I think for a lot of you today, that idea will probably either be based on or develop out of your PhD topic. And when you're looking to publish your PhD research as a book, I think some of our kind of most fundamental advice would be to wait until you have the PhD before you turn to this. Wait until you've finished the dissertation, you've submitted it, it's been awarded, and then try and come back to the research with fresh eyes. It's worth saying as well that most of our authors, we expect them to have received the PhD before we consider a proposal for them. So we don't, for example, publish books arising out of master's level research. That's not to say that other academic publishers wouldn't, but it's not something that we do. And I think if you're at that point in your career, it might be better perhaps to look at publishing in a journal instead. But once you have the kind of basic idea of what you want the book to be on and what it should look like, you need to work towards submitting a proposal. And every academic publisher will have their own proposal form, but they all really ask the same questions. And a little later on, Lucy will run through some of the common questions and some tips for them. In addition to the proposal form itself, different publishers will also ask for a certain amount of sample material from the manuscript. So at Palgrave, we usually just say 1 to 2 sample chapters is enough, but you might find that some publishers, if they know you're a first-time author and the book is arising out of your dissertation, they may want to see the full draft manuscript up front. And I think it's also worth clarifying that this sample material shouldn't be lifted directly from the PhD itself. You should have reworked it to show how you would envisage it being published in the book rather than just lifting it from the PhD. But once you have that material together and ready to go, that's when you could approach a publisher with it. And again, Lucy will talk through exactly how you can go about that. But once you submit it to a publisher, it'll be read by an editor like myself or Lucy. We might, if we think there are any potential series which could be a good home for your book, share it with the series editors as well. And really at that point, we'll take one of 3 decisions. We might, in rare circumstances, reject a book proposal, But as I say, that is rare and it tends to be for good reason. So, for example, we do often get proposals for books which are far more kind of trade orientated. And then it's the case that actually we're just not the right press. There's nothing wrong with the book itself. What's more common is that we would either ask you to revise and resubmit the proposal material. So we might look at it and think, this is really promising, it's on a great topic, it could be a good fit for our list, but it needs a little bit more work before we send it out for peer review. Or we might look at the material and think, actually, this is good to go, and we'll move ahead to the peer review process itself. Again, we'll touch more on the peer review process later on in these slides. But if we get the peer review back and it's largely positive, at that point, we would take a decision about whether to make you an offer of contract for the book. And if we do this, then the next step is for you to prepare the full draft manuscript, and then we'll work with you to publish the book. So just to talk a little bit about what we look for in a book. I know this might sound obvious, but we look for the research to be original, and research can be original in a lot of different ways. So in history, that might mean new archival discoveries. You might be bringing together ideas that haven't been considered in tandem before. Or as I mentioned a bit earlier, you might say that your work is interdisciplinary in its approach and is therefore contributing something new. And really what we're looking for are books that have relevance for an ongoing debate in the academic field. And these 2 points are really about that so what question. Why is your research worthwhile? What is it contributing? We also look for a book to have a clear, persuasive and coherent argument. And hopefully if you have those 3 things, then that means that the book will connect with a defined and realistic audience. As I've said, we are an academic publisher, so we don't necessarily expect our books to be bestsellers, but it is important that there's a viable scholarly market and readership for the book. We'll also consider how the book might fit for us as a publisher. So, for example, is there a series your book would fit into? How does it fit with our wider history list? And it's always useful for us if when an author submits their proposal, they show some familiarity with us as a publisher and why they want to publish with us in particular. There are a lot of publishers out there, so it is worth you giving some thought as to who you approach, especially because if you reach the point where a publisher says they're interested in your proposal and they want to proceed with sending it out for peer review, at that point they'll often ask for sole consideration until they know the outcome of the peer review process. We do sometimes get asked in sessions like this, well, how do I know which publisher to approach, which one would be best for me? And I guess one tip that I would give is that it can be useful to look at your bibliography and which kind of what secondary literature you've used in the course of your research. And is there a publisher, the name that comes up time and again in that? Because that would suggest that they are kind of a strong in your area and therefore maybe a good home for your own research. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I suspect that for, a lot of people in this call, what you might be looking to do eventually is to revise your PhD dissertation into a monograph. I think this varies discipline to discipline, but in history, the monograph is still the gold standard. And so this is what a lot of people tend to be working towards. And I guess really the first thing to keep in mind with this is that the audience for the book has changed, and so you'll need to adapt the scope accordingly. And what I mean by that is PhDs by their very nature are really quite niche and focused, and they're written for a handful of experts in your exact field to show that you really know your stuff. But with an academic monograph, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we need to be sure that there's a viable scholarly market for the book. So often that means that you need to widen the scope of your research somewhat. One tip for this is to look at published books in your field as both examples and competition. So how have people that have gone before you approached this? How have they widened their scope? And unfortunately, there's no one size fits all answer. There's lots of different approaches that you might want to consider. So for example, if your PhD focuses on a very kind of narrow chronological time period, you might want to widen that out. Or if it maybe only looks at one country or region, maybe you bring in other parts of the world and introduce a comparative aspect. Or it might be that in the course of doing your PhD, you came across interesting material which you had to discard or put to one side because it wasn't relevant to the PhD itself. And maybe now you reintroduce that material back in for the book. And so there is kind of a lot of thought that needs to be put in to revise a dissertation into a monograph. And that can involve rethinking your content and structure. It can also involve rethinking the length of your research. So for an academic monograph in history at Palgrave, we usually say they should be between 70,000 words in length up to 130,000 words in length. And that includes references and bibliography. You will also maybe need to look again at the style and readability to make sure that your book, the manuscript, will be accessible to this slightly wider audience that we're talking about. You'll also want to look to get rid of any telltale signs that the book started out as a PhD. So this can, for example, involve getting rid of excessive quotation or documentation, such as literature review. Literature review is often fundamental to a PhD, but you wouldn't expect to see one in an academic monograph. And so I think really there has to be a shift in mindset whereby with the PhD, you're looking to prove that you really know your stuff. When it comes to draft the manuscript for the monograph, you need to write with more confidence. You know, you've shown that you know the field. You don't now need to have the very extensive footnotes, for example, that are often kind of a telltale sign of a PhD. And really, you're kind of looking to remove all mention of the book's thesis origins, even in, for example, the acknowledgements. So it's obviously very natural to want to thank your supervisor or your examiners who have helped you along, the way. But rather than phrasing that as I want to, thank so and so for being my supervisor whilst I've done this PhD, just rephrase it to say, you thank them for their academic guidance over the years. And to be completely honest, the reason we give this advice is that we have found in the past that when it's really clear that a book started off as a PhD, it can affect the reception of the book on publication. So it can have a slightly detrimental impact on sales. It can also be reflected in the reviews that a book receives on publication. You don't want to receive the criticism in a review that not enough work was done to transform the dissertation into a monograph. You'll also perhaps want to look to reconfigure the chapter titles if you're widening the scope, but perhaps more importantly, also to reconfigure the book's overall title. So ideally, the title of your book should not be the same as the title for your dissertation. And this is increasingly important these days because now we understand that authors often have to deposit their dissertation into a repository. So what we need to do basically is make sure that it's really clear to readers why they should pick up the monograph rather than access the dissertation. What added value will a reader get from going to the published book rather than searching for the dissertation in a repository? And that said, I think it's worth just being realistic about the amount of work involved and your timeline for this. I know, especially for early career researchers, there can be a lot of pressure to publish quickly, but it is worth, if you can, taking your time to get this right and almost kind of overestimating how much time you will need because you'll probably have to juggle this process of publishing the book with various other commitments as well. And I guess finally on this slide, before I pass over to Lucy to talk about how to actually submit a proposal, my final piece of advice would just be to speak about this to other people. So whether that's with editors like myself and Lucy when you get the opportunity, or other academics and authors. So you might find that your supervisors or your examiners might have an opinion on how best you should publish your research. You can also look to your contemporaries. There'll be people that are at the same stage as you in terms of completing their dissertation or being an early career researcher, going through exactly the same thing. So how are they approaching it? Or if you know people who are maybe 1 or 2 years ahead of you with this, can they act as a bit of a mentor and give you insight into how they went about publishing their research and approaching a book? But I think that's all for me for a little while, and now I'm going to pass over to Lucy for the next part.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so the next couple of slides focus on the proposal form. So there are 2 ways that you can submit a proposal to us. The first is to complete our online form, which is on our website, with details of your book project, and then your book idea will be sent to the relevant editor for consideration. Alternatively, you can reach out directly to one of us. So all Palgrave editors' contact details are listed on our website. And the proposal form itself is quite straightforward, but we put together some tips which we think would be the most helpful to you. So firstly, the title. The title of the book should be really clear and descriptive. So most academic books are discovered online these days, so it's really important that book titles include key terms which potential readers might be using to search for books online. Although it might be tempting to go for a shorter, catchier title, we don't find that these titles are generally the most effective in ensuring a wide readership in academia. The next part of the proposal form is the book description. So like the book title, it's important to be really clear and convey the main arguments and contributions of the book. Think about who will be reading the book proposal. So commissioning editors like myself and Emily, potentially series editors and peer reviewers. So it's important that they can really quickly understand what your book is about, how it's contributing to research, and then make a decision about how to move forwards with the book proposal. Content. So we ask that you provide abstracts for each chapter as well as a table of contents. This will just allow reviewers to provide more detailed and constructive feedback. Next, think about the market and potential audience for the book. Be realistic here. Although it would be a bonus if your book reaches a general audience, the primary audience is likely to be academics. It's useful for commissioning editors to know instead which sub-disciplines or topics your research will speak to, so that we can position your research on our publishing programme. And finally, competition. So we sometimes receive proposals that say there's absolutely no competition at all. And this is actually a bit of a red flag for us because it poses the question as to whether there is any market at all. Even if there aren't direct competitors to your book, think about books which are on related subjects and think about the potential audience for your book and which books they might be reading.
Yep, I think it's back over to me. Is that right, Lucy?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah. So once you have, submitted your proposal, myself or Lucy have read it, we've shared it with series editors. If it's ready to go, then we would move ahead to the peer review process. So at Palgrave, we have a single blind peer review process, and generally we would seek 1 to 2 reader reports for each proposal. When you submit your proposal, there is a section of our form which asks you to suggest apt reviewers. And it's very helpful for us if you can do this because it gives us a steer to make sure we choose appropriate ones. But fundamentally, the peer reviewers will be selected by us as editors in conjunction with series editors if your book is being considered for a series. One question we sometimes get is, can I also suggest people who should not be sent to for review? And that is also fine, so long as you can explain to us exactly why that's kind of the case. Another question we sometimes get in sessions like this is about the timeline for peer review. So this will vary from publisher to publisher. It can even vary based on how much material you have submitted. So if someone will be quicker to review a proposal on a sample chapter than a full manuscript. But generally, when I say to an author, we're going to go ahead and send your proposal material out for peer review, I'll tell them that they should hear back from us within 6 weeks to 2 months, with the caveat that it can be quicker if the peer reviewer turns it around more quickly, or it can take longer. So, depending on what other commitments the reviewer might have at a given time. But we asked peer reviewers to give their opinion on a selection of issues, and we've listed some of the questions here that we would ask them. So, for example, does it offer a useful or original contribution to the field? Does it engage with recent scholarship? Does it take existing scholarship forward? And what are the general strengths and weaknesses of the proposed book? Once we have the peer review in-house, as I mentioned, in terms of the proposal stage, we would again take 1 of 3 decisions. So we might, if the peer review is very negative, reject a proposal at this stage. But again, what's far more likely is that we would either ask an author to revise and resubmit, and we would do this if the peer review is largely positive, but makes some quite substantial constructive suggestions for how the proposed book could be improved before approval. Or if the case is that the peer review is almost wholly positive, and we can just discuss its suggestions over email, then we might at that point go ahead and make an offer of contract for the book. What I would say with peer review is that it's very rare to get a wholly positive peer review. So there will always be some kind of suggestions for you as the author to engage with. Often peer reviewer suggestions are useful, but if you receive a peer review and you don't think for whatever reason that it would be a good idea to take their ideas on board, that's fine, so long as you can clearly explain to us why you think that's the case. But as I said, if the peer review is positive, it would be improved internally at Palgrave, and then we would make you an offer of contract for the book. So when we make you an offer of contract for the book, these would be the stages that follow after. So the first one is fairly obvious, which is drafting the manuscript. And when we make an offer of contract, we'll agree a delivery date for the draft manuscript with you. Again, as I said, in terms of taking time to really think about how you transform the dissertation into a monograph, I would also overestimate the time that you think you'll need to draft the full manuscript, because life and professional commitments, will crop up and potentially get in the way. And it's easier for us as a publisher to deal with a manuscript that comes in early rather than one that is delivered late. So as you work to draft the manuscript, one other thing you'll need to start considering as well is obtaining any permissions for third-party material that you might need. So this can apply, for example, to images or illustrations that you want to include in the book. And we usually suggest that authors start this process very early on because it can be very time consuming. Permissions holders can be quite slow sometimes to get back to authors. And it can also potentially be quite costly. So some permissions holders might charge a small fee for you to include their material in your book. And it's better to know that up front and early on, so that if you can't afford that, then you can start to look for alternatives. And gaining the permissions are the responsibility of the author. We as a publisher are on hand to help with any queries that might come up as you do this, but both the effort and the cost sit with the author. So these 2 points, as you're drafting the manuscript and obtaining the permissions, we as the publisher are on hand, and you'll be given contact details for who you can get in touch with if you have questions, but largely we leave you in peace and quiet. And then once you deliver the manuscript, we do what we call a clearance read. So a clearance read is really just a final round of peer review before we proceed to publication to make sure that the manuscript is definitely ready. And it's slightly different to the peer review at proposal stage, because at this point, what we're really asking the reviewer to do is just give us the green light to go ahead. And what we try to do more often than not is go back to the original reviewer from the proposal stage, because they're obviously familiar with the book and can comment on whether the full manuscript delivers on the promise of the proposal. If the clearance read comes back and suggests minor revisions to the manuscript ahead of publication, then we would give you as the author time to make those. And then once we have the final version of your manuscript in-house, we'll send it to our production team, who will copy edit it, provide you with proofs to check, and eventually you will have the published book. So once the book is published, all of our books these days publish in hardback and ebook simultaneously. And the ebook will be available from our own online ebook platform and also third-party retailers like Amazon. The main metric we use these days to measure a book's success, as it were, is not print sales. It's actually downloads of the ebook. And on a book's Springer Link page or Springer Nature Link page, you can see I've circled at the bottom left-hand corner something called accesses. And what this number is the number of unique chapter downloads this book has received since its publication. Partly this shift was happening already before the pandemic, but once everything kind of moved online, that really dramatically increased this for us, whereby students and researchers will now more likely than not access the ebook rather than going to the library and actually getting a hardback copy. So that's our main metric that we use for books these days. Now over to Lucy.
Yeah, so one of the ways authors can make their research as accessible as possible is to publish their book open access. So on average, OA books have 2.5 times more citations than non-OA books and 10 times more downloads. So it really is worthwhile. And at Springer Nature, we've published over 2,500 OA books, and we've worked with over 200 funding partners. So we do have a lot of experience in this. We offer both gold and green OA at Springer Nature. So gold OA is when a book is made immediately available to the public for free in exchange for a book processing charge. This is usually paid for by a funder. Authors can also choose to publish a chapter of an edited collection open access in exchange for a smaller chapter processing charge. All OA books are published under Creative Commons licenses, which allows readers to freely share, reuse, and build upon them while still allowing the author to retain copyright. Alternatively, if gold OA isn't feasible for some authors, they can also choose to self-archive a portion of their manuscript in an institutional or funder repository after an embargo period, and this is more commonly known as green OA. Next slide, please. Thank you, Emily. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the OA funding landscape is constantly changing. And in the last few years, we've seen many more funders implementing open access mandates, including UK Research and Innovation, or UKRI. So UKRI's OA policy was updated at the beginning of 2024 to include books. So it's now a requirement for books originating from UKRI-funded research to be made OA within 12 months after publication. And to support authors in choosing gold OA, UKRI is offering funding which can go towards the OA book processing charge or the chapter processing charge for an individual chapter. So at Palgrave, our gold OA offering is compliant with UKRI's open access mandate. But if immediate gold OA isn't viable for some authors, we have also adapted our standard self-archiving or green OA policy to enable authors to comply with UKRI's mandate. So basically, either way, if your research is funded by UKRI, we will be able to make sure that you comply with their new open access policy. Next slide, please. Thanks. And yeah, I just wanted to touch on the Research Excellence Framework because they have just recently published their full open access policy for REF 2029. And some good news, there won't be an OA requirement for long form publications, which includes monographs, edited collections, and book chapters. So an OA mandate for books was originally proposed in the draft policy, but in response to community concerns around funding, this was removed. So the next assessment exercise will begin in January 2029 when a new OA requirement for books might be implemented. And I think that is it from me. So I'll hand back over to you, Emily.
Thanks. So we just have one final slide before we open it out to questions, which is just about our campaign for the humanities. So this is across Palgrave, and I think it's really just an effort on our part to kind of show our support for the humanities. We know that the humanities compared to the sciences, for example, can often struggle with funding or the recognition or the appreciation that they deserve, but we're very passionate about them. So we do have a campaign for the humanities page on our website, and if you have time and you want to have a look at it after this, then I would just encourage you to do so. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And hopefully we've got questions in the chat. And just to say as well, Kathy mentioned at the start that, oh, I think I've frozen. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah,
You're fine, Emily.
Okay. No one's moving on my screen, but that's fine. Kathy mentioned at the start that if you are interested in speaking to me or Lucy one-on-one, you're more than welcome to do so. We have some meetings in the diary already for this afternoon. But if this afternoon doesn't work for you, we can instead pencil something in for another day. So I can see that Kathy's just put the email address in the chat. If you email them, they can put you in touch with me and Lucy, and we can take it from there.
Thanks, Emily. That was brilliant, and I know I've learned a lot from that presentation as well. And we do have a few questions in the chat already. The first being from Tara Weinberg, who says, what is the average time taken between gaining the PhD and submitting the book proposal for publication, then having it published? So basically the kind of timelines between PhD and publication when you're turning it into the monograph. And obviously I know this will vary, but yeah, an idea of that I think is useful.
Yeah, I mean, it will vary massively, which I know is a very kind of imprecise and unhelpful answer. But what I would say is that maybe some PhDs lend themselves more easily to being adapted into a monograph than others. So it really is a case of looking at your own research and seeing what work you might need to do as an individual or asking for the opinion of others on it. So ask your supervisor, for example, or people that you feel you can ask to read through the manuscript and give their advice on it. But I would say as well is if we receive a proposal where we think not enough has been done or further work needs to be done in that transformation, then we will say that to an author. It wouldn't be enough for us to reject a proposal, but we would ask them to perhaps revise and resubmit. I don't know, Lucy, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's also good to take a bit of time away from the PhD once you have completed it. Take some time away from the research and maybe come back to it, and you might kind of look at it in a new light and have a bit of a better idea about how to adapt it into a monograph in the ways that Emily mentioned in the presentation. But yeah, as Emily says, it can really vary. Yeah.
Yeah, and that relates to a similar question as well in the chat around the time taken to convert the manuscript in the PhD into a book manuscript. And I think, like you say, it's ultimately the answer is it's going to take additional work. There's no getting away from that. The time's going to relate much more to the amount of work that's going to be needed, I suppose. And I agree, Lucy, as someone who's not looked at their PhD for a very long time, but would still like to do something with it eventually. It's amazing after a bit of space how you feel about it. So one of the other questions was around open access fees. Can you shed any more light on that? Obviously, it will be a concern for early career researchers who might be interested in open access but not have access to the funds. Yeah, if you could just shed a bit more light on that.
Yeah, should I take that one, Emily?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, so OA fees, they do depend on certain things. So, for instance, the length of the book and the particular format. So, it can really vary. So, what we'd recommend is if when you are coming to submit a proposal, if you are interested in open access, just to mention that to us directly and we can talk to you about that further. But as I said, we do also offer green OA. So, if the kind of gold OA route, which is where you pay the book processing charge, if that isn't feasible, you should be able to self-archive your work and make sure that your research is publicly available.
Yeah, and maybe just to add as well with that, Lucy talked about UKRI specifically and the ref, but depending what kind of part of history you work in and who you've been funded by, they might have their own open access requirements and mandates. So it is worth checking with your funder. So for example, the Wellcome Trust will cover the BPC for research that they have funded, or at least they will a lot of the time. So it can be worth you as the author checking, who potentially funded your PhD, what are their open access requirements, what do you need to meet from their perspective.
Thank you, guys. So the next question we have is around marketing of the books and Palgrave's involvement in that. What's the kind of process for that?
I would say a lot of it is done online these days. So we obviously have kind of our social media accounts, we have mailing lists, email campaigns. We also go to quite a lot of conferences throughout the year, and we do that in person. So, this year, for example, Lucy and I went to the American Historical Association at the start of January, which is the big US conference. We'll be at the European Social Science History Conference in the Netherlands in March. We'll be at the Social History Society Conference in July in the UK. And that's a great way to get word out about books in the academic community, because we will have a book stand at those conferences and we'll always take along relevant titles. But we also have a dedicated prizes team. So if you know of prizes that you want to put your book forward to, there's an online form you can submit to them and they'll take care of sending out any copies that need to be sent to kind of the nomination board. And equally, we also have a reviews team as well. So if you get asked for, a journal is interested in reviewing your book and they need a copy of it in order to do so, then we have a reviews team that will take care of that. I don't know, Lucy, if I've missed anything obvious.
No, I think that's everything.
Thank you. So we have a question about existing material that has been published in a journal article and using that then within a book manuscript. Would you be able to speak to that question around reusing that material?
Yeah. So that's not generally not a problem, and it's quite common for people to have already published a journal article on the same topic. Most of the time, authors will probably be rewriting and adapting the article, so it's not sort of exactly the same word for word, and in which case that is completely fine from a permissions perspective. But if you are actually reproducing the article kind of word for word, you probably will need to get permission from the publisher of the journal article. But in terms of material that's already been published in the new publication, it's fine to have kind of one chapter which is based on another article.
Brilliant, thank you. I think there's some fear in the chat about these fees associated with open access and other potential fees to authors. I think maybe just a line from you guys around how ultimately authors don't pay you to publish them, and just clarify that a bit more might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we wanted to be transparent in the presentation, but maybe we went too far. But just to offer reassurance, when I talked around permissions and getting the rights of third-party material, a lot of rights holders won't charge a fee, or if they do, it will be nominal. So it's not like you are going to be massively out of pocket to get those permissions if you need it. And as I said, if you know nice and early that they'll charge a fee that you don't want to pay, you can always look for alternative sources instead. So, permissions are the author's responsibility, and that's why it's worth looking into them nice and early. But there are ways and means kind of around having to be out of pocket for them. The only other cost that you as the author might incur to publish with us is the index. So all of our history books have an index, and if for whatever reason an author doesn't want to compile that themselves, then they have to hire a freelancer to do it for them. But I would say 9 out of 10 of our authors are quite happy to do the index. Their best place to do it, it's their book. And so there's no cost incurred with that. And if anything, we do as a publisher pay the authors something to publish their book. And I think Lucy can maybe speak a bit more to the open access fees side of things. But again, we don't expect the author as an individual to bear the brunt of those costs. The open access BPCs or CPCs will often be covered by a funding body or an institution, not the individual.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Emily.
I was just going to agree with you there, Emily. And it's usually your institution which we will invoice for the BPC, and then they would often be reimbursed by a funder, for example.
I actually have a question as well then. Well, I have two, but I'll just ask one for now. But it comes off the back of that around early career researchers who don't have institutional affiliation, because this is increasingly common now, just because there aren't that many jobs. So can you maybe, my question is, will that impact their prospect in terms of publishing with Palgrave? And are there some practical things around there that are going to be a challenge?
I would say it wouldn't have any impact on how we consider your proposal. I think what's more important to us is that you've got the PhD. And I think we're very understanding then that, as you say, it's a tough landscape to get that first position in academia. So the proposal form will ask for a short bio, and if you make it really clear in that you got the PhD, that's really what we're looking for. And then we're understanding about the fact that not everyone is lucky enough to go straight into kind of a relevant academic position. But I don't know, Lucy, if you have anything else to add.
No, I think you've kind of covered it there.
Thank you. So there's another question here. It's around kind of, I think it's more to do with the amount of historical evidence that is used because obviously during the PhD, as you talked about in the presentation, you do go into quite intense detail, evidencing a lot and your primary sources. I think we just maybe revisit that point around how that might be, the nuance and the significance of evidence might be stripped back, is still important, but maybe stripped back a bit more in the text for a monograph.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if the material is integral to your argument, then by all means keep it in. I think maybe what I was talking to more in that point is perhaps more in terms of references to secondary literature, where you want to footnote everyone who's ever published anything in that field. to show that you have read everything that is out there. You know, in a monograph, you wouldn't feel the need to do that. You might reference the main ones that you've drawn on or that you've read, or maybe put them in the bibliography, but you wouldn't have these, you know, sometimes in a PhD, half the page is footnotes, and you wouldn't see that in an academic monograph. But in terms of kind of primary source material, if that's what you've relied on and that's integral to your argument, then by all means keep it in. I hope that's kind of what that question was about.
Yeah, thank you. And they've replied saying that's really helpful. Thanks, Emily. I don't know if you can see this question in the chat. I'm unfamiliar with this. So is library supply a source of sales these days, or through online platforms such as Ingenta, EBSEO? I don't know what that means personally, but maybe you might be able to shed some light.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could talk generally about our sales or business model. So as I kind of mentioned briefly, these days the main way our content is read or our books are read is via the ebook rather than the print book. And the way that a lot of institutions or library will access that ebook is either through subscribing to our history collection through our own ebook platform, or perhaps going through you know, a third party. But that's the main way. And I've just seen, yeah, someone else has put in the chat that search database often used by organization, uni institutions. So I don't think we can actually really talk to the side in terms of how at the institution itself people might search for that content, but the main way that we kind of deliver it to libraries is via our ebook platform.
Thank you. I have a question about the Palgrave pivot, and sorry if I missed this during the presentation, but obviously for the academic monograph, they usually supply to sample chapters, maybe even more, especially if you're a first-time author. I'm wondering, is that the same for the Palgrave pivot, considering it's much smaller and slightly different in terms of its sort of format and presentation?
I think we'd be happy to move forwards with kind of one sample chapter for a Palgrave pivot. Yeah, I think especially if you are adapting from a PhD dissertation, we would like to see some sample material. But yeah, as you point out, a Palgrave pivot is a slightly different book. It is quite a bit shorter. So it's between 25,000 and 50,000 words. But yeah, ideally at least one sample chapter to move ahead with peer review.
Thank you. Another question in the chat asking about sort of the value of print-only books. This is a much bigger question, I think, but around sort of print-only open access and whether that's something publishers sort of whether they would consider print-only now or if that's obsolete.
I mean, all of our books are print and hardback simultaneously, and I honestly don't think we'll ever reach a point where we stop printing hardbacks. There'll always be a place for print books. There'll always be demand for them. It's just that, you know, even a dozen years ago, the demand was weighted more towards print. Now it's weighted more towards the ebook, but both have immense value. And I think even with the shift to OA, you know, we'll never move away from print books completely. But I don't know what you think, Lucy.
Yeah, I was just kind of going to say on OA as well. Obviously, it's something that we encourage, and you know, if you have funding for it, that's great. But it is kind of a smaller portion of our publishing program, open access books, and it's absolutely not a requirement from us. Yeah, and we're aware it is quite expensive. So yeah, just to make that clear, even though we encourage it, it's not something that we make compulsory.
Yeah, and maybe just to reiterate, actually, that open access is still a very small part of what we publish. So the vast majority of our history books are not open access, and that's absolutely fine. We don't favour an open access proposal over a non-open access one. That's not how it works. We just treat both kind of proposals the same, and it's more about kind of, I guess, the quality of the book and the contribution it's making and what the peer review says. That's what we base our decision on. Whether it's actually going to be open access or not doesn't kind of come into play for us when taking a decision about whether to publish.
Brilliant. That's really useful. I think especially for people who are now feeling a bit anxious that there's going to be fees involved, and Alison's asked again about independent scholars, but I think we covered that around how independent scholars who have non-institutional affiliation, as long as they explain quite clearly in the bio that they have their PhD and their kind of credentials as an academic, it's institutional affiliation isn't necessary to move forward with publication with Palgrave. That's how I understand it. But Alison, if I've misunderstood your question, please do raise your hand. People, if they want to ask questions personally as well to Lucy and Emily, if you want to raise your hand, you can come on and actually ask them yourself too, as well as with the chat. Don't have any more questions in the chat at the moment. Sarah, I'm just going to, can I just invite you to come back on screen if you're there?
You can. Indeed.
I'm just wondering if there's any broader questions that you could think of that might appeal to, especially as this meeting's being recorded, to our broader membership. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot a bit now. I'm thinking myself, but just that might be worth capturing here in the questions and discussion that we might have in mind.
Okay, well, in terms maybe of the ref, I wondered if you could speak to the Palgrave pivot versus the traditional full-length monograph.
Yep, Lucy, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
You can take it.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's fine. It's because my screen is now completely frozen, so I have no idea if someone's like going to talk or not. Yeah, so Palgrave pivots, they do count towards the ref. They have been included in previous refs. The Palgrave pivot format has been going at least a dozen years at this point. I can remember the first one actually publishing. And I think that might have even been the ref before last, and we had some pivots included in that. Obviously there'll be people at your institution who you can maybe talk to about the ref and what you might plan to put forward or what your output might be for it. But we have had Palgrave pivots included in previous refs.
That's good to hear, because I'm really interested in doing one as well. Sarah, sorry, you were going to talk then.
No, I was just going to say that's wonderful. Thank you. The other question I had maybe was around trade publishing. I know you two, obviously, you're involved in a different area. But if, for example, you were to use the same research in a trade book as you want to also use in an academic monograph, would you have any issues with that? Was it a big no-no?
I think it would kind of depend on sort of how different the books were going to be, because it's fine for you, the same as kind of the question earlier about a journal article. It's fine for you to have published research and then in an article and then publish a book that is kind of based on the same research. So yeah, I think it would kind of depend on the extent to how different the books are and if they'd be competing with each other. Yeah, Emily, I don't know if you have anything more to add to that.
No, I mean, I think that's probably the crux of it, to be honest. Obviously, you wouldn't want them to, they wouldn't be anyway, but you wouldn't want to be, any parts of it the same verbatim in the two books. And it would be natural for you to draw on the same kind of research and findings and source material, but they would probably have to be presented very differently, not just to kind of avoid any overlap, but because if you were to go down the trade route, then that really is a very different type of publishing. You'll be writing for a very different audience, and so I just think naturally the two books would end up being quite different anyway.
Thank you.
We have some more questions in the chat. One is around actually taking one aspect of the PhD to turn that into the monograph, and the other is around the word counts as well. So between the Palgrave pivot and the monograph, just to clarify, because one person doesn't know which way it'll go, basically.
Maybe I'll take the first one and then Lucy can take the second one. So yeah, I think if you have kind of one part of your PhD that you want to focus on and build out or flesh out and have that be the basis of the monograph, that is absolutely fine, so long as it kind of speaks to what I mentioned in terms of the scope being broad enough to have kind of a viable readership. But if you think you can kind of take out one part of your PhD that will be of interest to people working in the same field, and you're going to kind of, that's what you're going to concentrate on, and then that can work. And that can actually, to lead into the next question, that can sometimes work really well for pivots. So sometimes we have people that say, I'm not going to publish the entire PhD, I'm going to take one or two parts of it, and I'm going to publish it as a very short book rather than a full-length monograph. But I'll leave Lucy to talk about word counts between the different formats.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So our kind of standard length monographs generally range from around 60,000 words up to maybe 100,000 words. And we can offer a bit of leeway on that, kind of like a 10% leeway. So, you know, depending on how long you think your manuscript will be. But I think what you're kind of considering, I think it's best to think about whether you would want the book to be kind of this shorter, more accessible pivot, or if you do want to kind of build on the research and make it a longer monograph. Yeah, I think if it's going to be 50,000, it could kind of go either way. You know, it's up to you whether you want to expand on it and make it slightly longer so it fits into the standard monograph formats.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question. Sorry, Emily, were you going to add
I was just
something?
going to add one final thing about that, which is that there is a little bit of a no man's land between a pivot and a monograph, so you don't kind of want to fall within that. But what we've also had authors do before is pitch us a proposal as a pivot or a monograph. We've kind of gone through the peer review and contracting process on the basis of that. But then as they've worked to draft the manuscript, they've come back to us and said, actually, it's going to be less than 50, or it's going to be upwards of 60, and then we can kind of change the format. So it's rare, but we can do that if, as you go to actually draft the manuscript, you find that suddenly what you thought was a monograph is now a pivot, or vice versa. We can be flexible with that.
And that actually happened to me and my colleagues. We proposed a pivot, and then it was like, no, just do the big book.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose there's something in that. I'd like to ask about scope as well, because we talked about the PhD into the monograph and how expanding the scope is really important for that. In relation to the Palgrave pivot, is it kind of more does that provide more of an opportunity to communicate quite some slightly more tight niche research in some ways, or is that just, it's basically what I'm trying to say, is it just down to word length, or is ultimately there's an opportunity of the different kinds of scopes within the Palgrave pivot compared to the monograph, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think like pivots are largely defined by their word count, like primarily that's how we see them, but within that word count there's a lot of freedom as to how authors want to use that format. So we do get some people who, as I said, maybe just pick one or two chapters and think I'm going to have a really kind of quite focused short book on this, or you know, maybe further into their career we get authors who come to us and say, I've had this research which is really interesting, but it's just been sitting in a drawer because I don't know how to publish it. So we say, well, why don't you put that out as a Palgrave pivot? Because then, you know, it's out there for people to read. Or Palgrave pivots, we also sometimes have people who kind of treat them as kind of like think pieces, so kind of very long essays, or even really short edited collections. With the Palgrave pivot, it maybe rather than have the traditional edited collection of a dozen people coming together, maybe you only have 3 or 4 chapter authors. So yeah, it's flexible with that format, really. I hope I've covered that, Lucy, unless you think of anything else people do with pivot.
No, thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Sarah about what can you expect to earn, if anything, from an academic monograph?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we want to go into specifics because it will vary publisher to publisher as well. But what I will say is, like, it's not going to be mega bucks. It's not going to be what you would get with a trade press. And so I think with academic publishing, whether you'll kind of get a remuneration on publication or a royalty, it is primarily for an academic audience. It's not going to be kind of a bestseller where either us as the publisher or you as the author, you know, make kind of trade revenue from it. So yeah, it can be good to just kind of temper expectations with that, I think, a little bit.
Yeah,
is there anything else you would say, Lucy, with that?
No, I was kind of thinking the same thing. Yeah.
I suppose ultimately, like, the kind of structures around academic publishing are built on the idea that people already have jobs where they get paid. Unfortunately, that's less and less the case, but that structure still remains in place. So, but that's not a conversation probably for today. Sarah, do you have? You've
Yeah, I was just
appeared.
I have. I was just going to cheekily sort of follow up and say, can you put some kind of number on that, just so that people have some kind of ideas? I mean, I've not to pin you down too much, but a sort of ballpark. Are we talking kind of £50, or are we talking something? What sort of what is it?
Yeah, it wouldn't be that low. I can offer that level of reassurance.
Excellent.
I don't want to kind of say a number or an amount, partly because, as I said, it does vary academic publisher to publisher as well. So there's kind of an element of us not revealing to competitors what we're doing, if that makes sense. But yeah, it wouldn't be that low. You will make something from it. It's just not going to be enough that you can give up the day job, as Kathy says, and rely on that as your income, as it were.
Thank you. That's tantalizing.
Which someone has asked a very interesting point. Why then bother with an academic book instead of a trade book?
I mean, that's a really good, honest question, and it is one that we get asked at these sessions. And I really think one thing we haven't said, and that we probably should have mentioned, is that when it comes to how you publish your research, you need to think what you as the author need out of the book as well. So what do you need the book to do for you? If you're going to stay in academia, if that's what you are kind of working towards, then you know, in the UK, for example, you need your book to be one that will be accepted by the ref. And in general, the ref will not accept books which are written for a trade year audience, maybe not seen as kind of academically rigorous enough. In the US, instead you have kind of the question of tenure. So you need to write a book and have it published with a press that the tenure committee is going to look sympathetically towards. So it really depends what you want to do next yourself, in a way, as to whether you go down the academic or the trade route. But certainly if you want to stay in academia, often then, you know, the ref and questions like that do come into play.
Thanks, Emily. Someone's had a question about Palgrave's reach into international academic circles, the US and Europe.
Lucy, do you want to take that one? I feel like I've talked quite a lot.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, we print and distribute books globally. And we also, as Emily mentioned earlier, we attend various international conferences each year. So I think we do have quite a good kind of foot in you know, international markets. So, for instance, like Emily said, we've just attended the American Historical Association, which is kind of the biggest history conference for the US. And then we're also going to the European Social Sciences History Conference later this year, which is kind of our biggest European conference. So yeah, I think that's kind of one of our selling points as a publisher, is that we really are a global publisher. And as well with our kind of business model of making sure that all of our books are published in digital format and part of our ebook collection, which we then sell via subscription to universities all around the world. Yeah, so we do definitely have a reach into kind of international academic circles.
Thanks, Lucy. I can see one of our attendees has put their camera on. Were you hoping to ask a question directly? Mary and Hugh. No, just showing your face. That's absolutely fine.
I think that was the question we just answered. So.
Right. Okay.
It was. When I teach, I like to see people's faces, so I tend to leave my camera on rather than just having a screen of grey circles.
Yeah, one can hope. Thank you. We have a couple more minutes if anyone has any other questions. If there's anything else, Emily or Lucy, you'd like to say, or don't forget, if you'd like to potentially book in with Lucy and Emily for a one-to-one discussion this afternoon, the mailbox for History Lab Plus is still open, and I can see some of those are coming through now. Do we have any more questions following on from the presentation today, though, that anyone would like to ask?
I think there
was
might be one.
more.
Oh yeah, I think there's one in a chat. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I've missed one.
From Rachel.
Oh, yeah, sorry, about timelines, turnaround from contract to manuscript submission and whether there's flexibility for the author around that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely flexibility, and we'd much rather set a deadline that is kind of realistic for the author than us imposing something that they just won't be able to meet. But I think the timeline does tend to kind of be 1 or 2 years. But yeah, we can offer flexibility. There's not kind of a hard stop to that. And obviously we do understand academics are very busy people, and also life gets in the way of things, and sometimes you might need to extend your submission date. We can be flexible with that as well.
Thank you. And I have a final question actually around a piece of work I've been working on at the moment, where it's we've been serializing some of the chapters via a mailing list, basically, and with the hope that we will have them published. We've not decided where or who or what yet, but the work's basically done. Would that approach jeopardize sort of the prospects of gaining a contract with Palgrave if you doing that kind of immediate public and academic engagement work with the direct text before actually then working into a formal publication?
I can take this one, Lucy, if you want.
Okay.
Yeah. My screen is still frozen. I still have no idea what's going on. But no, it's fine. Yeah. So I think it probably does come back to that question that we've already talked around a little bit, which is, would you plan to republish it kind of verbatim? What percentage of the book would it make up? Because I think with a book, what you really want people to do is, as I think I did mention, is give them the reason to opt for the book over the content that's maybe available elsewhere. So rather than going and finding the articles as you've been posting them online, someone should much prefer to pick up the book, and maybe that's where they're like you work up that material a bit more, you expand on it, or you bring in new contributions to the book. It basically just needs to have a bit of added value beyond what's already out there, as it were.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emily. And thank you, Lucy. I think we can draw the session to a close now. Thank you very much for the presentation. That's been brilliant, extremely helpful. I know for me it's been really enlightening, and we've had a really positive response in the chat as well. So I am going to stop recording now, but thank you everyone for coming today. This recording will be made available via the History Lab Plus website and via the History Lab Plus mailing list. If you haven't actually signed up for History Lab Plus yet, then please do go to the Institute of Historical Research's website, find History Lab Plus, and get yourselves on our mailing list, where we have lots of fantastic events coming up, as well as like this one today. I'll let Sarah have one chance to chip in any final comments before we call it to a close.
No comments at all.
Well, thank you very much for myself and Sarah, co-chairs of History Lab Plus, and thank you, Lucy and Emily from Palgrave. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks very much, everyone.
Just remove them because they've obviously gone for a walk. So I used to always do that when I'd finish teaching. I'd be like, who was actually there? Because you're all hanging around.
Good plan, actually.
That was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, it really was.
Really
No
good.
worries. Yeah, I think we had a good amount of people come, didn't we? And yeah, lots of positive comments. That's always nice.
There's some good feedback on, well, not good feedback, but we've got some reaction online as well.
Oh, great.
On Blue Sky.